All right, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar sponsored by UT Austin. I am going to first introduce Dr. Marilyn Tyus, our Assistant Vice President, who is going to share a brief welcome before we kick off the program. Dr. Tyus?
Hello, and welcome to this webinar on sharing strategies for managing COVID-19 in the residence halls. I am Dr. Marilyn Tyus, the Assistant Vice President over University Housing and Dining at UT Austin. Thank you so much for joining us today. During this session, our goal is that you will come to know more about our UT Austin residence halls, how we've expanded our partnerships, and how we're keeping our community safe during the practice, but also to check in and hear from you. We hope you remain connected with us with UT Austin, as we have many other webinars that are coming in the future. With that being said, thanks again for joining us. Let's go ahead and get the program started. Once again, welcome. We're happy you could join us. And I would like to introduce Dr. Mylan Kursky, Senior Director of Residence Life at UT Austin. Mylan?
Hello, everyone. As Dr. Tyus said, welcome to our webinar. We're really pleased to have you. I'm going to go through and start with a couple of features, just talking a little bit about the flow and how things will go today. So you'll notice that you can't see other folks on the webinar other than the presenters, and so that's just by design, so that way we can kind of concentrate in a conversational format. We will be able to see, however, questions that you might post in the chat. So we're going to ask that you place questions that you might have in the chat, and try to time your questions with the particular section that we might be on. That way we'll try to respond to them and answer them in a timely manner. If we're unable to get to them during the section that we're on, we'll save time at the end. We do have 20 to 25 minutes. We're hoping a little bit more for you to ask some questions that we can engage in collegial dialogue around these subject matters. So if we don't get to your question during the time allotted, we'll get to it at the end, or we will respond to it in the chat if we're able to do that in between as well. We have disabled the raise hand feature. So if you're looking for a raise hand feature, there isn't one to use, and that's only because we've deemed that it's a little bit easier for us to respond in the chat. And so thank you all for accommodating that. And so I want to take this moment to introduce our panelists. First, starting with Dr. Aaron Voiles, who's our Director for Residence Hall Operations within University Housing and Dining, followed by Mr. Justin Jaskowiak, who's our Director for Occupancy, Apartments, and Conferences within University Housing and Dining. We also have our colleague, Kelly Sosi, who's the Director for Student Emergency Services within the Office of the Dean of Students. And we will have joining us a little bit later on Dr. Terrence Hines, who's the Executive Director for University Health Services and our Chief Medical Officer. And so we will all be having different sections. I will serve as the moderator, trying to help the flow within the conversation and also responding to questions. And each section will be approximately 15 to 20 minutes. That way we will be able to get through talking about the major sections. And they are talking about our current realities. We'll start off talking about that. We'll talk about occupancy management and what we've done there. We'll talk about the residence hall operations and staffing toward the end of the webinar. And then in the middle, we'll talk about our partnership with University Health Services, proactive community testing, our risk mitigation strategies, sanitation, and different types of protocols and policies and procedures that we have within the residence halls. And so let me just transition to talking a little bit about the University of Texas at Austin, and then we'll go into an overview of housing, and then we'll start off with a poll. So University of Texas at Austin has about 52,000 students. 37,000 of those are undergraduate students. We typically house about 7,300 students on campus, living on campus. We have 14 residence halls and an apartment complex that we manage, 2,400 new ACEs. We also have 3 graduate housing complexes that are in downtown off of Lake Austin Boulevard in downtown Austin. We consider ourselves an urban campus. And typically during this time, right now, we have about half of our student population, about 45%, within the COVID-19 environment. So about 3,200 students are living with us right now this fall. That number may change for the spring. We're taking applications right now. And we have 336 students who are living in our apartment complex, 2,400 Oasis, and that occupancy level is around 50%. And so with that overview, I want to turn attention to a poll to learn more about who you all are on the call. And so let me get that going. So hopefully you all see the poll in front of you. We're gonna take about a minute, maybe a little bit under that, maybe 45 seconds to a minute or so. If you all could just respond to the two questions that we have there. Which best describes your current role at your institution? And also, out of the following options, what is a key concern that you have related to COVID-19 and the college housing residence life? And your responses to these questions will help shape the remainder of our conversation, so we thank you for that. Okay, I see we're almost there. 35 of 42, and we may be there, considering that the panelists, I don't believe, are inputting their answers. And so, all right, we have a pretty good mix. 32% identifying as entry level, 24% mid level, 21% senior level, 8% off campus housing professionals, 8% student affairs professionals, non-housing, and then 3% students. And yeah, so thank you all for doing that. And the second question we have, out of the following options, what is the key concern you have related to COVID-19 and college housing? And we're seeing that 33% resident compliance and conduct. We will talk about that. And then we're seeing 5% on the testing, 3% on the cleaning, 10% on the isolation, student engagement. What are we doing with students at 44%? So resident compliance and conduct and student engagement are the winners. We will be able to merge responses to those questions throughout our conversations with the various panelists. So thank you all. Go ahead and so that's just so you all can kind of see that there. All right. So let's transition into introducing our first speaker. Dr. Erin Voiles is going to get us started talking about our current realities and where we are.
Thank you, Dr. Kirksey. Good day, everybody. And wanted to talk just a couple minutes about some different key issues that we've noticed. You know, you may have different ones on your campus, or if this is a time for you to check in and see is what you're experiencing, you know, similar to what some other campuses are experiencing. And so whenever I talk about current realities, one of the first things that I always frame is that we sometimes don't recognize that there is a perception of time versus reality of time. We apply that, and actually the studies show that we apply this perception versus reality unequally to ourselves and others, right? And so generally speaking, that means we perceive ourselves as being quite busy, and we still design programs or design initiatives that assume that others are not as busy. And this is true for both students and staff, that it's happening on campus. And so, you know, as a reality for us within COVID, what I would encourage you to think about is how you're designing your protocols and thinking about if you're in this kind of dual mode, you're doing COVID stuff and you're doing all of the things that you would normally do in your program. How potentially problematic could that be for time as you're thinking about the staff and for the students? And I would say in particular virtually, because the tendency is to create more and more virtual opportunities in a lot of ways. And it may be for students who are already taking all of their classes virtually. They're already expected to go to all of their meetings virtually. And so then when students don't engage in those things, just being aware that, their time is probably already taken up by other things. Just because they're, quote unquote, in their room all the time doesn't mean that they're not busy. And that's definitely true for our staff too. And it's doubly true because we know that this is an environment that has increased fatigue on all of the employees and workforce that we have, throughout the country and throughout the world. One of the other realities that we have is really about competing expectations as well. And so this may be something that you're noticing. It's a thing that we talk about a lot is there are expectations that we're essentially able to run a quarantine facility and run a residence life program. And so for those of you who are on the ground at your university, you may notice that some of those things directly compete with each other. And so how do you run an environment that is going to be safe, but also engages students and gets folks, together? And some of those things, don't mesh well with each other. And we're noticing those competing expectations are coming from all different types of places. So they're coming from students who are maybe expecting and have been socialized to believe in this idea of the college experience, and the college experience that they're getting is not lining up with the experience that they've seen in media and heard from family and friends throughout their whole life. It's also coming from parents who are away from their student. Maybe their student is not able to, travel back and see them like they would have in some circumstances. And so the parents are feeling very remote, and they're hoping that somebody is going to reach out and have that personal connection and in touch with them. And in some ways means being in a physical space with them like the parent would do. But how is that possible or not possible for us? It can also come from leadership who want to ensure that we're providing an experience that students and parents see as value added, and of course from outside entities. And so for many of you, particularly maybe if you're at public institutions, you're in some form of shared governance with your legislature or other outside entities that are influencing and having a say in the governance of the university. And they may have different thoughts or expectations about what should be going on at that university or in those residence halls. Another reality is just new protocols, right? And so protocols for students who might need to self-isolate, who might need to self-quarantine, thinking about protocols that are around disinfecting, thinking about protocols that are around communicating with students. And all of these protocols, we're working more with other departments and maybe in some cases completely outside entities and community partnerships more than we ever have before. And also I would say that a lot of these protocols for us are maybe places that are outside of our comfort zone, right? And so I have my degrees in higher education, not in facilities management, not in environmental health and safety. And so it's really going to be important for me to understand the partnerships that I have as I'm going through those things, because I'm not an expert on those pieces. And so that's a thing that we're increasingly kind of being asked to be experts on. And, that expands even out of higher ed as well, right? All businesses are kind of now being asked to be experts on some of these issues. And so that's one of our realities. Of course, student concerns. So I mentioned that students are wanting that college experience. And so we are seeing some isolation from students, students who, even if they're participating in virtual programming, aren't seeing it as valuable as an in-person programming. Our typical motivators or mechanisms for engaging students are not there. And I know, student affairs professionals, we like to say it's not about food and t-shirts, but in some cases, those run the economy for getting students to programs. And so What are you doing now that you don't have something that says, hey, yeah, just come out of your room, let's go downstairs, let's grab some pizza, and then suddenly you've got a connection, right? The onus is on the students now more so than ever to take part of that. And so some of our students are not as well equipped to self-manage those issues and do that. And so that does lead to questions of value, right? What am I getting out of this that I couldn't get out of being at home? But also in the student concerns are unaccounted for student issues. And so we have seen a drop in some of the reporting around, it's not seeing as many mental health issues come our way, or Title IX cases come our way. And even some conduct issues outside of, what was brought up in the poll about, COVID-19 compliance is reducing. Do we think those things are all going away? Or is it really that we're needing to change our mechanism for how we're getting information and engaging with students about those? And I do think there's an external point here too, because this also enters into the shared governance piece of outside entities, potentially looking at those numbers and saying, isn't it great that mental health issues are down and Title IX issues are down? Because they're not being as reported as much. And so making sure that we're also being able to tell the full story and be able to respond and support students who need our assistance, support, and follow-up. And then at UT, within those, a couple of things that, specifically have really come up in this year, which is, trying to determine when we really have enough data to change practices. And look at that. And so, this is all very new. And so, for example, right now we do not permit guests on campus. And so, if we wanted to change that policy, when is enough data enough to say that we should change that policy? If we're expecting another spike as flu season goes up, or our numbers are one way, but could they change, the next way tomorrow? And so just trying to space out and make sure that we're making informed decisions. Of course, partnering with outside entities and thinking about and having a communication strategy for all of our students. We're one part of a very big operation here at the University of Texas. And to many of our students, we might be the face of those decisions, but we might not be the only entity that is impacting those decisions. And so making sure that we're coordinating our message and making sure that we're able to share the information that students need. And then the last UT specific thing that maybe is also showing up for y'all is funding, from the sense that we really need to maintain in a lot of ways, and I'll talk about staffing a little bit later. We need to run a full program, but we don't have as many students who are on campus at this time as we normally do. And so, if we have less income coming from that, how can we still provide full service, make sure that all of our buildings are staffed in the way that students really are getting the experience that's going to lead to that value added? And so these kind of current realities really just serve as a backdrop to talk about the rest of the webinar and kind of where we're doing things at UT, and then engaging with, kind of discussion and question with where all of y'all's universities are.
Thank you, Dr. Boyle. Since it was such a pronounced question, or at least piece of feedback that our participants are interested in, can you talk a little bit about what we are doing in terms of discipline for students who may be needing a reminding on the rules, or have shown their desire not to follow the rules, which, by the way, I would say, we're really fortunate to have a number of students at this point really buying into and following rules at the University of Texas. We have a great campaign called Protect Texas that students are getting their information from, and they're really, I believe, owning the messaging and their personal responsibility in the social responsibility of taking care of the campus. But we do have protocols, we do have processes that are outlined. You mind talking a little bit about those, Dr. Boyles?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. I know this is, as I've been talking with colleagues around the country, right, this has been a difficult place for everybody. And it's not unlike any other conduct situation where we're really trying to balance community impact with also an educational environment for our students. And I think, you know, we've thought of COVID-19 differently, but that really is the philosophy for all of the student conduct issues that we deal with. And so I would say, you know, the first piece that we're been starting with is a proactive piece. And so we ask all of our residents as part of their terms and conditions to sign a series of acknowledgements to put up front what the expectations were going to be. And so those are things that, you know, are probably familiar to a lot of y'all. You know, got to wear a mask, can't gather in groups of 10 or more, as well as things like our guest policy and an awareness around what those policies were going to be in the halls. Our hope with that, of course, is that if you are a student who are you like, this is not the environment for me, at that point over the summer, there was an opportunity for you to you know, decide, okay, I don't want to live on campus. I'm going to cancel my housing contract. And so that was the first part. I think the second part was setting our protocols to help us monitor better. And so we set celebrated entrances at all of our residence halls so that our students would swipe in to the front of our desk. That allows us to monitor. We're fortunate to have cameras on our entrances and egresses. And that gets from the start students to be able to flow through a process where we can have some accountability around them, and figuring out new ways to monitor. So, you know, we've been looking at not only that piece, but where there's staffing is, do we need to change how we're doing rounds? Do we need to have different sort of night operations rovers that we haven't had before to look at some of those hot spots? We're looking at, you know, facilities solutions where that makes sense too, right? Is this something we can change in the door, make it an emergency exit, different pieces like that. And then we also have, in partnership with Student Emergency Services and the Office of the Dean of Students, something called the Behavioral Concern Advice Line, which this year changed to the Behavioral Concerns and COVID Advice Line. And so we have a great partnership with that B Cacao. And so as they get information, they also are able to share it with us so that we can follow up and learn what those maybe hotspots are, you know, follow up with residents on it. So that's all kind of the proactive approach piece. But of course, people still, you know, occasionally break the policy. And we really do take first an educational approach to that. And it really is about, you know, reminders, trying to talk with students about the impact. But we also look case by case every time there's an incident submitted with our liaisons in the Office of Student Conduct and Academic Integrity, and look at that case and kind of determine what the follow-up needs to be it something that is done by, you know, a complex coordinator, the hall supervisor, or if it needs to go to student conduct. And I would say that we have a great partnership with them. If there's any sort of repeated behavior, different things like that. And we are on the same page with them that our number one factor really is, what is the community impact? You know, so if somebody doesn't have a mask on, you can remind them to have a mask, they put it on. That's pretty low community impact. If somebody has 20 guests in their room, pretty high community impact. And so being able to talk through that, and I know that's maybe not, you know, a set answer for folks, but we really, this is also new that we're really trying to, you know, move through that in a way where we can be responsive to, you know, any mitigating or extenuating factors, you know, for a student, and make sure that we're responding in a way that's going to help them do the behavior that is going to be positive for the community.
Thank you. Before we transition to Justin, who goes by Jasco, there is one question in the chat that also mentions, just to dovetail off what you're talking about, Dr. Voiles, with there being such a needed focus on addressing behaviors, how have the hall staff been building relationships with residents and being seen as something other than a regulator? So if you can just take maybe a minute or so to respond to that, and then we'll move to the next section.
Yes, I will try to be a little less long-winded this time. You know, it is a struggle. It's something that we're working on because RAs, you know, they feel that. And I think some students, depending on how their behavior has been, maybe experience the regulation a little bit more. And so really our focus has been what is the constant positive communication and contact that RAs are doing out there? So making sure that, their newsletters, their group meets, their pieces are out there, and that they're having an opportunity to be creative in the programs that they're offering, so that the RAs are excited about that piece, and as well as their supervisors, excited about that piece, and being able to have some job satisfaction. So, they're not just policing and regulating in the halls.
Thank you. And I would also add that the university is taking a concerted effort at trying to do larger scale programming as well, in a socially distanced, responsible way, in the open spaces around campus as well. And so our student leadership and development area is very active in trying to do pop-up programming and small pod type programming in the outdoor type spaces, utilizing our beautiful campus and the great weather that we have in Texas. So we have that to our advantage as well, and in partnering with dining, trying to do events. And as you all may or may not know, our football team is playing. And so we still are trying to rally around our football team and our other sports that are in session during this time too. So there's activity going on there, and there's testing, proactive testing prior to entering the stadium for students and the other types of larger events that they may be going to, even while they are socially distanced. And so let me take this time to transition to Justin Duskowiak, who goes by Jasko, to talk a little bit about occupancy management.
Thank you, Dr. Kirksey, and good afternoon, everyone. I will take this time to go over a little bit of what occupancy has looked like. And thank you so much, Dr. Boyles, for that picture of our reality, which was a reality we existed in throughout preparation, and now actually executing our plans that we drafted and edited and critiqued and then implemented as we brought into the fall semester. I wanted to take us back a little bit into March, when the University of Texas made a decision, like many schools across the country, to go to an online model. And we closed our residence halls and canceled contracts for all the students that were living within our residence hall. During that time, we did not do that for our apartment communities. And so while we will spend most of the time today in this webinar talking about our on-campus residence halls, I did want to bring to attention that we had our property just west of campus that is traditionally housing undergraduate students in apartment-style housing. And also, as Dr. Kirksey mentioned, our properties on Lake Austin Boulevard that traditionally house graduate doctoral students that are primarily international students. Neither of those buildings closed, but we did work with students if they needed to make a different plan for their housing in light of what happened at the time the university went to an online model in March. For the residence halls, we went to canceling all the contracts, helping our students move out of the halls, coordinating with a small handful of students for any emergency housing needs, and then began plans on what the summer and what the fall were going to look like. While we were making those plans, we were, as most places that are doing occupancy, we were already in contract offering period for this academic year. So we had students who had already applied to the institution, had received an acceptance letter to the university, were admitted, and had accepted a contract offer to live on campus. At the point where we discovered that the university was going to have a hybrid model as it related to learning for this fall, we were contracted with 7,000 students. And so this left us with a decision on how are we going to honor those contracts and care for those students while also making considerations for the residence halls, the space that they were going to be coming back to, working with the operations team on how to make sure our halls were going to be safe. And the decision was made to allow students, and Dr. Boyles kind of spoke on this, to allow students to come back to open the halls, but for them to have information on whether or not that was going to be the decision they wanted to make this fall. And so if a student saw what the protocols were going to be in the halls and felt like that wasn't for me now. We adjusted what our cancellation protocol looked like over the summer. We allowed students to share that information with us, to share whether or not they were taking a online only class model, and then allowed students to break their academic year contract. We did that without pushing any penalties to students, no cancellation fees, and even if the student had paid a prepayment, crediting that prepayment back to them. Doing that got us to the number that Dr. Kirksey shared earlier in this webinar. Before we got to move in, we were just under 50% of our spaces occupied. And giving students the opportunity to choose what was going to be best for them as it related to their housing for this year allowed us on the back end to also be strategic with how we helped students select rooms and how we populated the halls on campus. The occupancy team took into consideration, can we, in any place where we're assigning a student, can we make sure that we're not over assigning on one floor and leaving another floor or wing primarily empty, so students had some space. We also took the opportunity to identify spaces throughout the campus that we knew we would need for quarantining or for roommate conflicts or anything else that might happen throughout this academic year. And the model that we knew we were going to be operating within, we took time to identify spaces that would be helpful to us and holding those spaces for that. And as the year has gone by, those rooms have been used to manage conflicts, to help students move around as they might have a room change request, and to quarantine students who were a close contact to someone who had tested positive for COVID-19, but at that time had not been instructed to isolate in the isolation facility. The only other thing I wanted to be able to share is we're right now doing what probably many of us on this webinar are doing, which is planning for the spring and the summer. What is that going to look like? And we know that a couple of things are in existence. For one, the university has stated that after Thanksgiving break this year, no in-person academic requirements are going to be in existence. So we're already working with our students who are on campus, and any student that's going to be leaving at Thanksgiving break and not returning, they were going to receive a prorated credit for that time period where they aren't going to be living in the residence hall. So this is a student who's planning to come back in the spring semester, and they're making a decision to leave at Thanksgiving break time and not return again until the spring semester. They are receiving a credit for that. We're also working on our spring occupancy. We're currently accepting applications for this spring. And what our plan is, knowing that the university will continue with a hybrid learning model, is to offer spring contracts after students have had the opportunity to know what their academic course load looks like. Class registration is the beginning of November. And so once students have engaged in that activity, that's when we'll be reaching out to them to figure out what their housing needs actually are. So no student has to commit, put a prepayment down for a space in the spring when they're still unsure about what their academics is going to look like. And finally, we're in the beginning stages of booking conferences for the summer. While the university has shared that business will be pretty much as usual in the spring, there's also been an optimistic message that we might go back to business as normal, whatever that normal means, in the summertime. And so that has our conference groups excited. We are currently booking with those groups. We're working with event planners throughout the campus and other conference managers to talk through what protocols are going to look like. We have updated some of our furniture inventory on campus for events to allow for social distancing type events, especially if events are going to be occurring over the summer while conferences are happening. While we're currently booking, we're not going to start plotting conferences until we have a little bit more information, and that still aligns with our typical timeline with when we start plotting for conferences. And so that gives a little bit of an overview of where we were, how we got to where we are, and what we're starting to plan for as it relates to our spaces on campus, our residence halls on campus. And I think I'm supposed to turn it back to you now, Dr. Kirksey.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jasco. And let me just, there are no questions in the chat at this particular point. And so at the conclusion of both of these sessions, let me just say a quick shout out to both Aaron and Jasco, two of the most consummate professionals that I've ever worked with, absolute stellar professionals. And I have the privilege of working with them every day as their supervisor. And I also have the privilege of working with this great colleague that I'm about to introduce, Kelly Sosi, who's the Director for Student Emergency Services in the Office of the Dean of Students. And so I'm going to turn it over to her right now to talk a little bit about our partnership and how we work together for students in serving their needs and also for isolating students off campus.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mylan. So as my role in the Office of the Dean of Students, we oversee working with students in a non-clinical fashion when some sort of crisis comes up. And so obviously COVID is a huge crisis to our students. And so since March, my team has been doing a lot of different things to support our students to be able to move forward academically. That's our main goal. How does a crisis not impact their academic progress to graduation? Because that's why they're here. So with housing students, some of the things that we were helping with on the front end that, Jasco mentioned as far as emergency housing. So helping partner and look over those applications to determine, does this student have a legitimate need to be on campus while we're figuring things out. We also managed an emergency fund that gave out over $3 million, including laptops and other technology support when our campus, primarily residential, moved totally remote in March. And so those are some of the things that we did on the early end. However, during the summer, my team started planning for what does a normal look like with COVID long-term. And so we actually added a COVID case management team. And so that team has 3 individuals as well as 2 administrative staff that support the addition of COVID-19 to our behavior concerns and COVID advice line. And so when students have questions about where to get tested, what do they need to do when they have to isolate or quarantine, or, hey, I need academic accommodations because I've been impacted because a family member is really sick with COVID. All of those different things our COVID team assists with for our housing students. The main area that we've collaborated closely with housing is the isolation facility, which is actually run by the city of Austin. We are very fortunate to have this opportunity in Travis County because we know not everyone is that fortunate. They utilize a hotel near campus where a student is allowed to have their own space, including their own bathroom, so it meets the isolation CDC guidelines. They're provided meals throughout the day to their room, so they're not having to leave at that point. Also, the facility provides medical and mental health support through their stay. And so students are checking in twice a day to talk about their symptoms, determine, are they getting toward progress as far as being able to be discharged. And then that team works with our case management team to determine if a student is ready to come back to the halls. We're communicating that with the leadership in UHD so that they're able to provide access back to that the permanent room, et cetera, so that everyone knows that that student is past the infectious state, et cetera. So transportation to the isolation facility, because our on-campus students often don't have a car. There are 2 ambulance companies that the isolation facility contracted with to make sure that both the driver and the student are safe when they're infectious. And then when they are done with isolation, we reimburse the student for a ride share if they can't afford to get back to home. And so Our case managers are checking in with those students throughout the 10 to 14-day stay, making sure academically they're doing okay, but also taking care of those basic needs. And so that's really how our team collaborates with housing. The other piece is that we know crises don't stay 9 to 5. So we've got an on-call response that is specific to our COVID team. So if someone, let's say, gets their test results after 5, we're still able to support that student to get them to isolation when needed.
Thank you, Kelly. And Kelly, again, is absolutely amazing at everything she does. And particularly in this COVID-19 environment has been just exceptional as we've had to kind of fly the plane as we build it. And so we really appreciate your partnership, Kelly, and our ongoing relationship as things emerge. I'm looking in the chat and I don't see any questions related specifically to student emergency services or how we're partnering here. I do want to give this just a minute just to make sure that if folks are trying to type something that they can do that before I turn it back over to Dr. Voiles to talk about our staffing and some other areas within the residence halls before we have our colleague, Dr. Hines, join us after 2. So is there anyone who has a question that they either want to put in the chat or vocalize? Kelly, there's a question about how do we connect the ambulance to provide rides?
Sure, absolutely. So currently the ambulance is a contracted company, and so once a student goes through the intake process with one of our case managers, we hand that student off to City of Austin. They then call the contracted company and have them go out. And so there's a charge of about $125 for each time we need to use the ambulance, because that includes the disinfecting and all of those things at the end. And so that's how the ambulance picks up the student, and that's for anyone in Travis County. So even if our off-campus students need help, they have access to that. Is your after-hours role a paid staffer? So we have a couple different things. Our on-call staff do have a stipend for when they're holding the phone. And so it's just a little thank you for, you know, your life might be a little bit difficult this week. But they also do earn regular work hours if they are responding to a crisis afterwards. And so that turns into comp time within state of Texas so that they can use that for vacation, sick time, et cetera, if needed.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Voiles to talk a little bit more about our residence hall life operations, our staffing model, and the protocols therein. And Dr. Voiles, as you talk about that, if you could talk about our communication protocol for notifying students related to COVID-19 within that, since we're kind of fresh off that topic, I would appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Yes, I can. So maybe what I'll do is I'll talk about staffing, but I'll start with the protocols where we're really working with student emergency services, which is in the self-isolation and self-quarantine sections. And so the way that we are set up is that our self-isolations, we have different tiers of information, and perhaps you know, your school is doing this as well, and if not, I would definitely encourage you to think about what are those tiers of information. And so kind of tier 1 is what we would consider HIPAA information, and so that is the smallest group of folks, and so everybody who has access to that information, and 4 of us, which may be everybody in the department who has access to that, are on this call. So Dr. Tyus, Dr. Kirksey, Jasco, and I are HIPAA representatives. And so we underwent a training around medical data for student information. And so I bring that up as the first level because a lot of our student isolations we're finding out from medical personnel. And so that data needs to be the most highly restricted in terms of response. And so when we're working on student isolation, either Jasco or I are the individuals from housing who are supporting from our side to make sure that we're respecting the information and privacy of those residents. We do have a kind of what I would consider, tier 2 is, the FERPA data. And that really is primarily, residents, life staff who have a need to know. And so that could be a case of where a student informs us of their own status, and it is often the case with self-quarantine as well. Students most often inform us if they feel like they need to self-quarantine or go through that protocol. And then kind of the third tier that we have is really for staff safety. It's still guided under FERPA and is protected in that realm, but we choose to kind of separate out to provide less information. And so we have an information tier for like a facility supervisor that doesn't provide them with any student information, but maybe provides them with a list of rooms that are rooms that we shouldn't perform any work orders in at this time. And so that's kind of how we triage our data to make sure that we're managing information in an appropriate way. And so as we kind of go through those processes, when we're working with student emergency services on an isolation, we'll make sure that, information to protect staff who might get to that room is filled in. We'll make sure that we're working with the student and on the student side. And so if they are leaving campus, we will, well, if they're isolating, they're leaving campus. But so we'll make sure that their access to the residence hall is temporarily shut off so that we can make sure that they get the medical clearance to come back on. We will provide information back to our medical professionals if there's information that they might need that we have for contact tracing. Most often, that's going to be a roommate if there is a roommate. And the reason that we provide that information back is just that in case they're having trouble getting information from the student who's involved to the student who tested positive, we're able to share that information back, even though our university health services may not be sharing information in reverse as much. And so university health services will conduct all of that contact tracing in terms of any close contacts. And anybody that meets the criteria for close contact or needing to self-quarantine. So UHS will do that. And then the university has a kind of a wider, what we would call a casual contact notification piece. And the casual contact piece does not inform students of the exact location or individual, of course. And also, we don't inform all students. And so what casual contacts is designed to do is get students who might be in a more immediate area around the student, but who are not considered to be close contacts. And so that might just be, there's somebody on your wing or somebody on your floor. Because you're on that wing or floor, you might feel better knowing that that information is out there. Strictly from a medical standpoint, casual contacts are not considered to be at any additional risk than any other student. That would be the close contact level. But we would refer to this, if you've dealt with other medical or infectious diseases on your campus, you have that kind of worried well situation. And so folks who aren't considered at an additional risk, but may want that information. And so that's kind of where the casual contacts notification comes from. And so that's really our role from the housing side on isolations. And with quarantines, some of our students are able to quarantine in their room. In other cases, if they need a temporary room, we're able to work with them for to find another room. And so there is a question in the chat about that. Are they allowed to stay in their room? So yes, if the student hasn't tested positive, they are, and they just need to quarantine, they're a close contact, they're able to stay in their room or to move if their room doesn't accommodate them in a way. And so they maybe have a roommate or something like that, and they need to move out of their room. We do have temporary spaces for that. For students who are quarantining, we have 2 different meal options that are available based on the medical guidance. And so one is that they can use what we call a resident meal request form. And so they can designate other individuals to pick up meals for them. Those individuals can either pick from a preset menu, so they can order that online and have the person pick that up, or they can choose, and I could be like, hey, Jasco, just go to the dining hall, get whatever they've got today. And Jasco can pick out and, and fill out a to-go box in the dining hall with them. We also have express meals to go. And so within the health guidance, they could leave, pick up a meal and go without entering any of the dining facilities. And so that's also an option for students who are quarantining on campus. And just to make sure everybody knows, I know sometimes we switch those, right? Isolation is a positive test and quarantine is a close contact. And so anybody who is on campus for us and is self-quarantining is not tested positive. So a couple of other things that I can hit in terms of our protocols, and as questions come in, I'll answer those, is just staffing. I alluded to that we are maintaining as close to full staffing as we can, because as part of our risk mitigation practice, we have students all over campus. Then we wanted to make sure that we had staffing all over campus. And so we did not reduce our number of RAs. We have all of our 24-hour desks. Every residence hall has a 24-hour desk. Those are open. They're operated, with RAs, desk assistants, and our night staff. And so the only place where we made changes is, we did move around responsibilities. So, if not many people were living on a floor, we didn't leave an RA with 3 people. We rearranged a little bit so that everybody would have, an equitable workload from that. If we get in I'll mention, if we do get in a case where we had staffing issues, right? And so a bunch of staff members had to quarantine for some reason or different things like that, we do have a desk closer priority procedure. And so we have an order that we would go in so that we can continue to provide service to students and let them know what desks are open. And as Jasco mentioned, we also are transitioning to a hybrid mode where all classes will be virtual starting after Thanksgiving break on November 30th. And so our staffing plan, our RAs are working primarily virtually, and then we'll have some RAs who are working on campus, providing that on-call coverage as well. And so we're doing both, right? We're in person, we're always kind of in this hybrid situation where we're both operating virtually and in person and providing service for our students who are there. To prepare our stuff, probably like many of you, we set up a bunch of task forces over the summer. And so we divided our task forces up into student policies, staff policies, desk operations, move-in, curriculum, and then each of those had a combination of, some of our leadership team members, our complex coordinators, our assistant complex coordinators, and graduate students to work together and develop those plans. And then those plans were routed through our legal affairs office, as well as environmental health and safety. So as we were coming up with protocols, making sure, as I mentioned before, one of the things, we're not necessarily experts. And so we wanted to make sure, hey, what's the best way to do this type of protocol? And so I've talked a little bit about the student policies. In terms of staff policies, really, we wanted to rewrite our policies in a way that minimized contact, right? And so not putting our students ever in a position where, our student staff feel like they've got to be in an enclosed space with somebody and they're unprotected. And so what are the ways, redoing our behind closed doors? What are the ways you can address something from the doorway? What are the ways you can do a welfare check virtually? And what are the things that you need to look through? And so those are the protocols that we really went through. And then I would say, making sure that we took a pause on protocols where we weren't sure until we were sure. And so we're doing our fire drills a little bit later. I think they're starting this next week here because we really wanted to hammer out, we have a building that's 1,400 students normally. And so how do you do a fire drill in that and stay safe? And so we really had to work through a protocol of, what's a floor by floor, fire drill. So like many of you, we joked probably a lot. It's like, it's now like what is this and COVID? And that's kind of, how we reapproach. And this was a great opportunity. If you haven't done that with everything and you're kind of like acting, case by case or on an individual base, it really is just a great opportunity to see if what you were doing could be updated anyway. Because some of the ways that we changed move-in, I hope we never go back. And it was just, we figured out more efficient ways to do things. We figured out safer ways to do things. And I think, at least for, even if we have a lot of good news and we got a vaccine and numbers go way down, students for the next several years are going to be wondering, what are the safety protocols that you have in place? And so that's a piece of that. And their desk operations, we definitely looked at, are we doing any checkouts? We're not doing any checkouts of, kitchen equipment, because we don't have a way to really ensure that equipment at our desk is going to be sanitized, in between. And so those are a piece, a lot of those kind of minor things. I won't go through all of those, but that was a piece of what we were looking at. Even for we used to let people have a snack during their shift at the desk. Is that something we can really do, or did we need to, shift that to a designated area? You can probably tell from the way I worded that the answer is yes, we needed to shift that from a designated area. And also procedures for end of shift. So how folks are wiping down things and doing pieces there. And so with that is our PPE, which for our in-hall staff really is divided into two levels. There's our base PPE, which is, folks who have, doing desk work, day in, day out. They have a mask or face covering. They have access to hand sanitizer, gloves, and disinfecting wipes. And then we kind of have the plus level. And so I said we've rearranged all of our protocols really to minimize contact. But let's say we had, in the middle of the night, there's a flood. That RA's trying to grab the wet vac and get into the room. And so we have a second level that we have in each of our buildings in emergency closets that have face shield, goggles, foot covers, aprons, and we also have a electrostatic mister that can disinfect spaces as well in there. And so we kind of have those two different levels. The way we organize as a larger department is we have a warehouse that collects all of the PPE together and has an inventory. And then in our area in Residence Life, we order on a monthly basis. So we project out what we need, order, the warehouse delivers to us, and we have each of those go through the director of that area. So I'll sign off on all of those just to make sure that, it's a situation where we're fortunate to have a lot of PPE, but we want to make sure that we continue to have a lot of PPE. And so making sure that we have protocols to keep everything accountable. And so we did project out all of the PPE needs that we thought we would need for every single desk shift, every single on-call, every single round over the summer, so that we would know kind of at what levels to purchase. And spoiler, the level is lots. And I do see a Q&A question about virtually as well. And so I will answer that as I get into that. I think that's related to the curriculum pieces, which I know about student engagement. There were some questions or some interest in that as well. And so from the curriculum standpoint, all of our official events right now are virtual. Our student learning and development team, as Dr. Kirksey mentioned, is doing a lot of large-scale campus-wide events. And they're also developing and working with our on-campus conferences and events group to establish some consistent guidelines for RAs who want to do in-person events, so that we can kind of move in that direction. We're cognizant that when our RAs signed up for this job, there was not a pandemic. Right. And so we want to make sure that staff are comfortable in the situations that they're being asked to do. And so we're making sure that we do it right. So that's why we've kind of started at this virtual piece and are moving towards, having some in-person guidelines and things that are going to be consistent for RAs, so that we don't have a situation where, one RA feels like they're being asked to do something that the other one is not. As we're working on that, one of the other key components for us has really been discussing with our campus partners And so we have a great partnership with what's called Texas Parents. They work with our parents and families and guardians of our students, and making sure that they understand and communicate, so that way there's no missed gap of what that expectation is from parents who might think we're out there, just doing like, hey, everybody on the floor, let's all go get coffee. And that's not really a place where we can be, and making sure that they understand why. I know probably a lot of you are dealing with the same thing we are with those competing expectations, which is that there is some frustration that there's not as much in-person engagement happening. My personal take on that is we really wanted to start in the safest, most risk mitigation environment that we can, and then make sure we have the data to move into another environment. And so I would much rather us be criticized on that standpoint than be in the other place where we're out there doing events, and we have 172 RAs, and and we don't want to be out there doing events before we really have all of the protocols locked down in a way that all the students who are on here feel safe. And so that has been our number one priority around that, which is why we've had professional staff running the big events too. Is professional staff can make sure that they've got all of the setup that they need, all of the disinfecting that's going on, and all of those pieces. So the question that I got is, when RAs are working virtually, what do those assignments look like in comparison to on-campus staff? So the main difference is that they're not doing on-call or desk shifts. We're going to continue to pay for those things. So similar to the way that Kelly talked about paying for folks to hold the on-call, we have a setup system for any time where we're in that type of situation, winter break or other places where the RAs who are on campus receive an hourly rate to respond to that on-call. And then we continue to use our administrative assistants, night operations, and desk assistants to fill the staffing levels. All the programming things are still happening. Those expectations are around the board. Checking in with students, welfare checks happening virtually. Those pieces are all still expectations. We don't do a major a checkout at winter, so most people are coming back for the spring. And so there's not a lot of maybe what you would consider a closing task to happen. Okay, so I feel like I really have been jabbering on for a while. So I appreciate everybody listening. And I see a question on how is the guest policy being enforced? At all levels. And so what I would say is we do, the guest policy applies to, and I'm not sure exactly if this is asking like, are we enforcing a guest policy on RDs or anything? So our hall supervisors are full-time staff. There's no guest policy for them. They're living in their own apartments. There's a definite, work-life balance. If you've lived on, you know the deal. And so they're still able to have guests. We're fortunate that almost all of our live-on full-time and grad staff have external entrances as well. So I acknowledge that not all schools will have that. For the guest policy and for students, which does include RAs, because we're funneling through the celebrated entrance, if somebody's swipe doesn't work, they're not permitted entrance currently. And if we find people that have been sneaking people in or different issues like that, then, I'd refer back to what our student conduct process is. Is it really an education issue? Is it something that we're having some repeated, pieces? And are there any mitigating circumstances? We had a student who, broke their leg and had to have surgery, and then their dad wanted to come check on them. Okay, that was a place where we could arrange an exception, right? That made sense in supporting that student, versus somebody who just wants to have friends over to do a party. And so then the student conduct follow-up happens. Almost always that's going to be first step is through an administrative meeting with the hall supervisor. So I'll pause there, see if any other questions come in, or if any of the other panelists want to pick up anything that I might have missed, because that was a pretty expansive section to talk about our operations and staffing. And so, just want to make sure that I didn't leave anything hanging out there.
That was great. Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, you had quite a mouthful to be able to share there. You did a great job doing that. And so we do want to pause for a moment to see if there are any other questions that are coming in the chat. It sounded like those questions that you received came directly to you because I didn't see them in the chat. So that's okay too. But if you want other folks on the call to see your questions, make sure you put to panelists and participants as you're writing that. So there's a question in the chat. Is UT still involved in recruitment activities, meaning showing tour rooms despite your guest policy?
Jasco, do you want to talk about the virtual stuff that's going on? The physical answer is no, we're not doing any physical tours.
Yes, so we're not doing any physical tours right now. We are currently working with a vendor to get all of our images, all of our spaces photographed into 3D images and put those online. So all the photographs were completed during the summer while our spaces were empty, and we're currently working right now to get that live. I don't know that I've seen yet a definite time when it should be live. I know that some of that probably will be dependent on when all the licensure and everything is completed, and some of that might be out of my control. But the on the field work is done, and so we're looking forward to having that as a resource, not only for our internal partners and admissions to be able to use to show for tours, but also for just anyone that's interested in seeing what the spaces look like. The idea is that this is something that will be accessible on a website.
So there is a question in the chat. Did you do anything different regarding training of RAs and RDs? Do you want to talk just a minute about that, Dr. Williams?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, probably the most obvious thing that y'all are all going to anticipate is that we trained almost exclusively on Zoom. We did do a combination of synchronous and asynchronous training activities. And I think for us, the really great part about that is that because we recorded sessions like this one is being recorded and then had other modules that, you know, folks could go through, it's actually helping us in the long term. Somebody comes on later, they still have access to all of the training, you know, things instead of, you know, talking with the hall supervisor for a day and being like, yep, let's go. And so that's been really helpful in modernizing what we have to be able to scale our training continually. We did do some training in person in terms of behind closed doors because those are things that RAs might have to respond to in person. And so we did do that in person, and it became a rather extensive process, of course, because normally behind closed doors would happen in small little residence hall rooms. And so we used a bigger space, a lot more staff to be able to have smaller groups so that every group of RAs going through was about 6 people. So with 172 RAs, you can do the math on how many groups that is, and using lobby spaces to have larger spaces as well. The other two kind of interesting things is that we did allow for staff to have watch parties if they wanted to all do the virtual training in a way where they could be spread out and be under 10 people. And so, and some staffs are bigger than that, so they might have split into 2 groups and then been in a large space and separated out. And we did that because we could follow the event guidelines for the amount of spacing that was needed, the amount of cleaning that was needed. And certainly some staff liked that idea versus getting, you know, like, because you get that kind of bonding in different pieces. But all of those options were opt out. Everything had to be available for folks to do, you know, by virtual means if they weren't comfortable, except for, again, for the behind closed doors, which you have to do in person because that job duty is in person. And we also partnered with dining to test out their dining facilities. And so this was a place where, since we had to feed the RAs anyway, our RAs were able to go and test to make sure that the procedures at the dining halls were being efficient, and then RAs were given survey opportunity to give feedback on how those were going, so that those protocols could be kind of addressed in terms of being kind of like a soft open for our dining staff. And so that was really helpful. Yeah. Oh, and I see Justin answered that. Yes, we use Canvas as our basis platform, but you know, any of those platforms, Moodle, Blackboard, whatever you have is perfect.
Thank you, Dr. Voiles. And let me just take a moment to circle back on a topic, and then Jessica, I'm going to ask you to share a little bit about what we did and how we augmented our contract process through our agreements, and what we did there in terms of, I think that's an important part, even though I know most folks are past that point, but they may think about doing something different in the spring. And then I'm giving my colleague, Dr. Hines, an opportunity to get on the call. He's just joined us. He's one of our panelists. And so we're gonna touch base on this, the roommate question one more time, then we'll go to our occupancy, and then we'll provide an opportunity for Dr. Hines to share information related to what University Health Services is doing at the university. So Dr. Voiles, if you can chat just about what we are looking at right now in terms of our roommate policy, because as you shared earlier, you know, we have data that has been coming in and information from students, requests from students for those who really do desire to have more of an in-person contact and who need some more engagement with other people, and how we're trying to do that in a safe way.
Yeah, I think, you know, we're a curricular institution, and so we're also using RoomPact now, and one of the tools in RoomPact is through the roommate agreement and some activities that we've been trying to facilitate opportunities for roommates to connect with one another, and also folks on the hall to connect with one another. And then kind of broader than that, working with RAs to, each RA is being given the opportunity to kind of develop what their in-person, maybe it's not their curricular plan, but it's like a community development additional plan. Sorry, it seems weird to say plan on top of plan, but activities for community development. And so they're being asked to think about those at different levels. And so different RAs might do that differently, but this is the place where they can be the folks who are prompting their team members, hey, you know, this lounge can fit this many people. So the hall, you could go and do the debate watch party there, as long as you're all separate. And so trying to be in the position of where RAs are not necessarily guiding all of those programs, but prompting students to be able to manage for themselves what their comfort level is so that they can move in. I think one of the biggest keys for us is making sure that students have that information so that they can make the choice. And one of the things that we've been finding is, you know, we're having to use more and more avenues to get information out, and maybe do it a little more frequently than we would on those virtual means, you know, emails, group me's, there's a website that we have called the Longhorn Connection as well, and some of those opportunities to make sure that students can find each other. And, you know, if they choose to increase their bubble to have that student in it, then, you know, then we want to help them facilitate that in a safe way.
Thank you. And let me just also share that we are in the process, you know, our resident assistants have spoken to our residents and they talked about the guest policy as well. And so we are in the process of looking at it. And what we said to students in the beginning was that guest privileges will be suspended until further notice. It was part of our agreements that Jess was going to talk about in a second here. But we have since gotten information from them and feedback that they would like us to revisit that. And we planned on doing so mostly in the spring after we had more data to see how COVID was going to go this fall and also into flu season, which we're still about to embark on. And so it's a little bit faster than what we wanted to reconsider, but our students, you know, they have needs as well, their social, emotional, mental health needs. And so we're thinking about what does it look like maybe to allow for a guest, and how do we regulate that, and how do we work with them? So we're working with our student leaders on that, our RA staff, because they're the ones who would have to enforce that and trying to figure that piece out for them. So that is a point that has gotten brought up. And so let me just take 1 to 2 minutes, Jasko, if you can talk a little bit about, because I think this is important, what we looked at doing differently with our contract once we figured out what type of program we wanted to run. And then I'm going to turn attention to our colleague, Dr. Hines. So Jasko.
Yeah, 2 quick things to touch about as it relates to the contract. First, we wanted to examine it for language that let our students know we were going to be working with them and being in a place where what we like to say is be able to pivot. If the university is going to do something like what we saw in the spring, that we wanted our students to have some confidence in knowing how we would treat their contract, what we would do, what would happen. Would we credit them if worst kind of, so worst case scenario where the university is closing again, are we going to be able to do that like we were able to in the spring? And so getting that language changed so students could see that as they were moving into the residence halls. Because again, as I mentioned, a lot of decisions that were happened after we contracted with students. We contracted with students before the university went to an online only model in March of 2019. And so getting that language change was important. And then every year we engage in an activity where we look at our policies and say, okay, what do we need to update or change? And as our contract states, the students are responsible for knowing what the housing policies are and for abiding by what those policies are. What we wanted to do differently this year than what we've done in past years is actually call out the things that were changing as it related to COVID. And so we called these things our agreements that students were basically able to acknowledge and see prior to moving into the residence hall. It didn't mean that not acknowledging them would mean I don't have to follow them. That's not how it was set up. It was set up to let them know, we want you to know that we changed policies because of COVID, and you need to see them because our staff is going to be asking you to comply with these. And those included wearing a face covering anytime you were outside of your room, wearing a face covering in your room if staff needed to come in to do to complete, for example, a work order that you may have put in a maintenance request for. That's our staff would be in wearing PPE, and they would ask you to also put on a face covering. To comply with any postings that were in the halls, to be prepared to swipe and show your ID at all times entering the hall. As we mentioned, restricting access to the halls where you had to be a resident in order to get in, and as well as the guest policy and any sort of gathering in a public space, that number was reduced to under 10 for if you were going to gather in a large, we have very large study rooms, some are in Jester and in Kinsolving, that would be taken into account, that you wouldn't gather in groups larger than that. So we wanted to make sure those things that we changed within our policies as in response to managing COVID, that our students saw that, were aware of it, and didn't have to go to the right page in the manual to get all the most important information before they moved in.
Thank you, Jasko. And I do see a question that's in the chat regarding UT planning to alter spring break, like A&M or winter break, to offset what may be seen by students as a loss of student or class time. I'm not sure if anyone on the call knows the answer to that question as to whether or not we're planning on altering spring break. I myself do not know, or I'm not sure of that answer. That's information that we could get back to you on. We can take down participant information, and I think I know the person who's asked that question, so I could get back to them. But Kelly, do you know anything about that?
Sure.
Okay.
What we're determining is that we'll still have our hybrid model, but no, we are not altering what our spring semester looks like, at least at this time. So obviously we'll continue to reevaluate based on what's going on, but that's kind of the current status.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, well, I'd like to, at this point, turn the floor over to our colleague, Dr. Terrence Hines, who, as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, is the Executive Director for University Health Services and also the Chief Medical Officer. He's going to talk a little bit about what University Health Services is doing to support the campus and our students and staff.
Well, thank you, Mylan. And UHS and UHD have a great working relationship and have really partnered well throughout the response to COVID-19, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with you all. Let me first begin by just mentioning the services that UHS provides, and we're sort of the on-campus student clinic. And we pivoted to telemedicine very quickly in the spring, much quicker than we had aspired to in the past, and have focused primarily on delivering care through telehealth. About 2/3 of our clinic visits at this point are telemedicine, whereas prior to COVID, 0% were telemedicine. So that's been fantastic for us and something I think the students have really appreciated. And we continue to deliver routine services, women's health, allergy, immunization, travel, or urgent care, in addition to evaluating and diagnosing COVID-19 as well as case management for those patients. I thought at this point I would kind of walk through the UT Austin COVID-19 dashboard. And Justin, if you're able to share that screen, I can kind of talk folks through that. One thing that has been really important to the university throughout this process is to try to be as transparent as possible while balancing as well public health and privacy concerns. And so one of the ways we've done that is in building this dashboard and putting it as a public-facing dashboard for the community. And so this first section looks at COVID-19 cases by date and separates them in terms of both faculty and staff. So if you'll scroll down a little bit more, you can see we had a big peak kind of right after move-in. We think that was a lot of imported infection, people coming in from other places who were already infected. And then another big peak was related to football testing. So big ticket holders, students who have sort of a season pass were required to test prior to attending the home games. So for that first home game, there was that big spike. That is antigen-based testing. And unlike the city of Austin, we include antigen-based testing. The city and county do not include that on their dashboard. So for people who are diligently studying the differences between the two, that's why there is a difference there. And so we kind of break down then our case counts beginning in March when COVID hit. Next is August 26th when school started, and then active cases, which we've just defined as anyone whose symptom onset was in the past 10 days, and if they did not have symptoms, whose test was in the past 10 days. So currently we have about 65 active cases in our UT community. And I guess I should be specific. We are including people who are not necessarily in Austin, not necessarily on campus, but who report their result to us because we do consider them part of our UT community. Going into the second section is proactive community testing. This is really what we've dubbed our surveillance program. And it has evolved over time, but is now a CLIA-approved saliva-based test. And it is performed through a collaboration with the high throughput testing core lab, which was stood up in the College of Natural Sciences. It is asymptomatic testing for UT community members, and our goal has been to test about 1,000 per day. It is a voluntary program, and so we've worked very recently on some incentives to get students in particular to participate, as well as to improve access to the testing. We have an app where they're able to complete consent forms to sign up for the test. We are on multiple locations on campus and have recently started doing off-campus pop-up testing as well. And it is free to all faculty, staff, and students to participate in that. You can see in the bottom right corner of that section, our positivity rate is 0.68%. For combined faculty, staff, and students. I mentioned the football testing earlier. We did have the big spike for the first football test. For the second football test, we did not see that spike, and that testing population came in at about a similar positivity rate to what our broader PCT testing was doing. I guess I should mention as well, PCT, we kind of break it down into 3 different domains. The first is individuals we've identified at higher risk because of their inability to socially distance, because of their occupation. So included in that would be residence hall occupants. And in the first 2 weeks of move-in for the next 2 weeks, we did focus on testing residence hall folks. And then others be like people by occupation, so child development center, custodial staff, health staff, so higher risk groups there. Next would be expanded network testing. So when individuals test positive for COVID-19, we do their contact tracing. We test primary or close contacts, those who have been within 6 feet for 15 minutes. But then we also invite those who we identify as casual or secondary contacts to also participate in PCT. That might be anyone who is in an in-person class with the individual. It might be a wing or floor of a residence hall, for example. And then the third would be the sort of random voluntary testing. And then just going down to the last section, this is looking at clinical positivity rate. So in particular, focused on individuals who were symptomatic or were contacts and were advised to test. And we are in a combined right now 2.79%. Within our community, Austin Travis County, the clinical positivity rate is 3.8%. And so we're very encouraged to see that our numbers are sort of consistent with our greater Austin community. So that's the dashboard. I think I talked a little bit about PCT as we kind of went through this. And the last thing I wanted to mention was contact tracing. Of course, contact tracing is when someone is identified to be COVID-19 positive. Our staff reach out to them, find out who they've been in contact with in the days preceding their diagnosis or symptom onset, reach out to those individuals, give them advice on self-quarantine, as well as testing. And we do that through a collaborative effort with UT Health Austin, which is the clinical aspect of Dell Medical School, as well as Health Point Occupational Health Program at the university, and it is a delegated authority from Austin Public Health. The data software they're using, if you're interested, is called GoData, which, as I understand it, is very robust and has some excellent capabilities in terms of identifying clusters, tracking sort of networks or lines of transmission, and we get all those results automatically or simultaneously from testing done at UHS, UTHA, as well as self-reports from individuals, and then for those who test off campus, those results are still filtering to us through Austin Public Health, and so part of that process as well, through the case management and also the contact tracing, is connecting students to the resources at the university, such as student emergency services, assisting them into moving into the isolation facility if that's needed, assisting with professor notifications. And so we really view all of these things as sort of wraparound services to our students, faculty, and staff, and want to be a resource for those folks. So I'll pause there, Mylan, and happy to answer anything else you might have for me.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hines. I'm looking in the chat. I don't see any questions coming across right now, but I would like to, as I wait for folks to see if they're going to ask questions, I would like to let you all know that we had, or we have joined us on the call, Don Ates, who's our Director for Residential Facilities, and Eric Geiger, who's our Senior Director for Dining Operations within our offices. And so they have joined in preparation for, or in the event of, you all having questions related to facilities and dining as we get to the Q&A portion, which we are now at. So great timing, everyone. Thank you all for your incredible information, your efficiency and effectiveness in conveying the message and getting out the message on what UT is doing. So now is an opportunity for you all. We tried to leave a robust amount of time at the end because we know that dialogue is some of the best parts of these webinars. And so now is an opportunity for participants to continue to ask questions either in the chat, or Dr. Samuel will make it available so for individuals to ask questions aloud if they'd like to. And I just want to let you know, we're not opposed to ending webinars early. So, you know, it's going to be like a going once, going twice. No, we'll pause for a few minutes here, or a few seconds, see what happens. Okay, is anyone seeing a question privately asked to them? I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
Mylan, I saw one that came in that I think Jasco could answer, which is,
Okay.
Do students have roommates or are they in singles?
Okay, go ahead, Jasco.
Yes, so some of our students are in rooms where they do not have a roommate. As Dr. Kirksey mentioned, we have about just over 3,200 students living on campus. Roughly 900 or so of those do not have a roommate right now. The remaining students do have a roommate in their space, and we are working with students if they are wanting to do a room change, looking for a different kind of housing option. We are working with them to figure out what their needs and preferences might be to see if we have something that would match that. But that's what our breakdown looks like right now.
Thank you, thank you. Did anyone else see questions that I may have missed or don't see on my side?
Dr. Kursky, we might want to say that those who do have roommates are by choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. And as Dr. Tyus just mentioned, one of the things that we were fortunate to be able to do was to have that latitude available to students. And so students right now have that choice on whether or not they want to have a roommate. And for those who are choosing not to have a roommate and we're not housing other students with them, they are able to remain in their room at no additional cost to them. And so we've been very fortunate at the University of Texas at Austin to have a central leadership administration as well as a divisional leadership to support these types of efforts through programs and also monetarily to withstand some of these changes that we've had to make related to COVID-19. So I see a comment in the chat. Thanks. I heard Dr. Hines say you all are doing contact tracing for confirmed cases. What do you do with roommates of suspected cases with symptoms?
So certainly anyone with symptoms is advised to immediately begin self-isolation and to be tested. Now, a roommate perhaps who was without symptoms would most likely be considered a primary contact. They would be advised to self-quarantine and then we would recommend testing at a later date, assuming they remain asymptomatic in about 3 to 7 days post last exposure.
Thank you. And I also see that there's a question about how are we handling ADA room accommodations? I suppose we're handling them in the similar way that we always have, but I wonder if there's if there's something that's generating that question that we can get to more specifically.
Yeah, if there's some additional specifics with it, we are working to accommodate anything that we are able to. Still working with services for students with disabilities. Students get their documentation to that office, and then they share that with our staff on what the accommodation request is, and we work then with the student if the request is something that we are able to meet.
There's a question in the Q&A as well. I don't know if you guys have seen that separately.
Yes, I just saw is it the mid-semester checkout procedure question? Yeah, I just saw that. So I'm gonna read that aloud. What do your mid-semester checkout procedures look like? Without prying too much into your individual policies, I'm looking more to see how you have decided to check out rooms, if at all, for typical turnaround, such as damages, broken furniture. So Dr. Boyles, do you want to talk a little bit about that? And Don, if there's anything that you want to mention related to facilities, feel free. If not, we can touch on that if something comes up related to it.
Yeah, I'll kind of tag team it with Don, because he can talk about the protocols for facilities to go in. So it could depend on what the situation is. If there's no known, there's no positive, there wasn't a positive case there, it's not a quarantine case, then our staff can still conduct a check if we need to. So we have that second level of PPE to enter a hall. We work with, there's a liaison within our department who is our safety specialist coordinator who works with EHS, who will advise us on anything that we need to do with a room entry procedure. And so in a lot of cases where a student maybe has checked out, that advice right now, and Don, correct me if I get this wrong, but I think is to wait 4 days, and then we would enter. And so we'll set the clock for that, and then be able to enter after that standpoint. If there's something that's broken or damaged or work orders, Don, do you want to talk about what facilities general procedure is to enter a room? Because that would apply for both the checkout and if we had to go in potentially for other reason.
Thank you, Dr. Bowles. At this time, our room procedures, when we get ready to check out, the first thing we do is we go to the room. We have our, like you said, second level PPE, which is we have a face mask, we have goggles, and we have face shields. And then we go in. We have PPE onto the shirt. Okay, not shirt. Overalls. Okay, we go into the room, and when we go in there, like he said, it's 4 to 5 days. I mean, it's at the discretion of the building maintenance manager, because we know that at the 4th or 5th day, really, we don't have too much to worry about after the 5th day. But we do go in there with caution, and at the same time, when we do approach the room, we still go in there and use our Victory electrostatic sprayer. And we do spray around, and we let that set for about 30 minutes. Once we let that set, then we go in our initial cleaning mode with our what I'm trying to say, microfiber rags and stuff, and that's when we start doing our cleaning. And once we get through with that, we pretty well just make sure everything is taken care of, then we just move out. But so far, we've been doing a pretty good job of that from what I see.
All right, thank you both. I want to make sure this question was answered. I see it in the chat. Was there an answer to the question regarding testing students prior to moving on to campus? There's a question in the chat that reads, apologies if I missed it, but I noticed there's quite a handful of students has required students to, or quite a handful of the universities have required students to be tested prior to moving on to the residential property for the fall semester. If this is not something you've done, is there anything that you all have in place for students financially that inevitably would need to get tested, whether they are having symptoms? We know this is a pandemic and there's a serious financial impact. So I think one part to the question that I'm perceiving is, did we require students to get tested prior to moving in? And the answer to that is no. However, the university president did issue a statement about a 14-day quarantine period that the university wanted students to go through prior to arriving on campus. Is there anything else any colleagues want to say regarding that part of the question? Okay. And I think the other part of the question, I'm not exactly sure where we're trying to go with it, but if I'm hearing it correctly, is there anything else we have in place for students financially that would inevitably need to get tested? So I think, when we talk about proactive community testing, I mean, that's the primary mechanism that we're trying to encourage students to do, and we're keeping track of that. I mean, we can respond more about that if Dr. Hines wants to talk about that. The other part about the financial impact, Kelly, I don't know if there's anything you want to say about how we're supporting students through student emergency services. But Dr. Hines, can I start with you? Is there anything you want to say more about proactive community testing?
Right, so proactive community testing for asymptomatic individuals is completely free of charge. For symptomatic testing performed at University Health Services, we do bill the students insurance. However, if they don't have insurance or if they have a copay, then the university subsidizes that balance. So the out-of-pocket charge to the student should be zero.
And then our student emergency fund is available to all students regardless of if they're Title IV eligible or not. And so if a student is having issues with a medical bill, let's say they got tested, ended up having to go to the hospital for a day because of COVID symptoms, we're able to help with that bill and work with the student more long-term as far as financial support.
Great, thank you both. So those are all the questions that I see in the chat, and I hope I haven't missed any, but certainly there's an opportunity here. We have like 8 more minutes before we start to wrap up. If there are any more questions from participants. I mean, if I was participating, I would think the panelists did a fantastic job of answering all the questions, because this is probably the most efficient webinar I think I've been on in a while. And this has been a phenomenal job of getting to the information quickly and thoroughly. Okay, we do see something here. Am I under the impression that in case of roommates, one checked out and one didn't, you decided to hold off on entirely or entering to check rather than use a 4-day waiting time? So do you all understand that, Aaron, Don?
Yeah, and partially it's case by case. What I would say is really our philosophy is not to nickel and dime, students with little things that might be wear and tear. In cases where we can wait, we're fine to hold off, and if we miss where the desk was, I don't know, rubbed a little bit or something, that's fine. That's a trade-off we've been willing to make sure that we're prioritizing safety of the students and staff. If there's something, egregious that we needed to fix before somebody else could move in there, that would be the case where we would do the 4-day waiting period, work with Mark work with our safety coordinator, and make sure that we're following protocols to do that, right? So, we can't lease a room that's got a big, I don't know why Justin's gonna make fun of me, because I always say if it's got like a hole in the wall, like that's always my go-to. So I must have had a lot of holes in the wall when I first entered into housing. But we are of course going to arrange to do something like that, because that's not a livable space for somebody. But if there is something minor that we can hold off on, then yeah, we'll be able to hold off on that. And so we really are handling it case by case, just to ensure that we're managing what we need to manage, but also making sure we're keeping the safety of our staff at the forefront.
Yes, and if I may ask what Dr. Voles just stating, once building services is through disinfecting and cleaning, we do have a maintenance crew that goes in behind those guys. And the maintenance crew, what they have on is they got masks, they got face shield, and they don't too much have to put on a PPE gown because the room has been disinfected and it's clear to go in. Once they go in, they do an assessment of themselves. Like I say, if you find something like he said, there's a large hole or something, we're going to address it immediately. But at the same time, if there's a charge needs to be assessed at a later time, we'll address that if need. If it's something that we think that been there that the resident didn't have no way of causing, it was just an accident or something, then we'll take that on and just go ahead and get it addressed. But once the maintenance crew leave out, then we'll send a building services crew back in and just do what we call a final light clean. Once they do the final light clean, the room is then turned over to occupancy to do what they need to do with it.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Don. So it's 2:46 right now, and I know there weren't any specific questions that were asked about it, but as a thank you for dedicating time and being here, I want to make sure to give my colleague, Eric Geiger, an opportunity to talk about some of the wonderful things that we're doing with our dining program. For those of you who have dining programs and may be interested to know how we're managing in this environment. Eric?
Sure, thanks, Brian. Us at UT Dining, much like other institutions, we're on many national calls, sharing best practices, and really gleaning from lessons learned from those programs that stayed open through the spring semester. Whether they were serving 300 or 3,000, those were things that were shared. So everything from priorities for students through national surveys indicating that speed of service was paramount. In order to achieve safety, they were willing to give up other things, so like variety. We focused on cross traffic, minimizing the opportunity for students to interact, so there's in and outs at the service lines. There is one entrance into the dining facility and then one exit. Everything is to go. And then there are separate entrances into our dining facility, so where they're actually the dining rooms. All the tables and chairs are 6 feet apart and everybody's facing the same direction. We've utilized draping. Basically, we're calling them clear shower curtains to kind of separate the dining space from the scramble area, the servery. And we're making sure that food is only going in one direction. So everything is to go. The main container is then given to the student. And then if they want something else, they're picking up smaller containers from other lines. So it really is about managing cross contact and then making sure that we're maintaining social spacing. To this point, with having landed and achieved the safe opening that was the target, we're now focused on expanding options. Students are into their patterns of behavior, so we kind of know when they're going to be there, and we've consolidated a couple of operations to provide more variety. We're talking to students while they're in line. We're talking to the Housing Association to get their feedback. So now it's a matter of how do we contribute to the experience of actually being on campus. Today we had a huge event in partnership with Housing and events, and that was fantastic. We celebrated the Texas Fair, though it's canceled. The OU game is still going on, so we had an array of outside empanadas, and there was, of course, corn, and there was all kinds of sausages and things for students to enjoy, and they got to try some traditional foods that were Tex-Mex, South Texas kind of fare. It was a great time. There was live music. We had the cheerleaders, so it really was a good time. Questions about dining?
Yes, thank you, Eric. All right. Are there any last minute questions before I prepare to close us out with thank yous to the panel and some of our leadership? And there's been some really nice comments in the chat, and we really appreciate you all appreciating us taking the time. And as a community of colleagues in higher education, we certainly feel the need to, each one teach one and to pay it forward. So thank you all for those wonderful comments. Let me just close by thanking again Dr. Marilyn Tyus, our Assistant Vice President for University Housing and Dining. who all things become possible with her support. And even extending beyond that, I want to thank our Vice President for Student Affairs and our Dean of Students, Dr. Sonsea Reagans-Lilly, for endorsing the idea of doing the institutes and for supporting us always in that. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not thank the director for our Institutes program, Dr. Justin Samuel. Is his face, have you made your camera visible? There he is, okay, who is the originator of this webinar, and he's the person who's making it all happen and facilitating everything behind the scenes. And of course, thank you to our panelists who have spent all of their time and efforts at making things great and changing the world at UT for our students and staff and community and stakeholders, and now larger higher education community through their contributions on this webinar and in all the places and spaces where they occupy and participate in conversations. So we want to thank you all for dedicating the time. And it may be a record, but we are ending our webinar ahead of time. So make sure that when you all receive your evaluations from Dr. Samuel, you let us know all about the things that you liked or things that you'd like us to do differently for the next time, because as Dr. Tyus said, you haven't seen the end of us yet. We will be back with other things that we would like to offer up to the profession. And so thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.